Fantastic. Okay, thank you very much indeed. I'm conscious that I'm competing against the sunshine and the beach and everything else, so I'll try my best to kind of keep you entertained and keep you engaged. This is joint work with Peter Shaw, Mateusz Mikusz, and Petri Numi, all of whom are here. We had a drinking game. I lost. That's why I get to talk. And I want to start by sort of reflecting for a second or two on, in a sense, kind of ubiquitous computing and mobile computing. And this picture sort of is supposed to remind us of Mark Weiser's kind of original vision of creating ubiquitous computing systems in which the technology was designed to fade into the background, to become part of everyday life. And in one of the papers, they talk about this idea of calm computing, and as you use systems, it being as relaxing, but as sort of as sensorily rich as taking a walk in the woods. And I think for a great many people, this has sort of inspired them. They've kind of trended to create systems. And particularly as we sort of start to think about creating the IoT, we tend to think about deploying devices such that they fade into the background. And we try and echo this idea of a calm walk in the woods. The thing about walk in the woods is kind of fairly frequently they turn into sort of scary things, right? So, you know, one minute you're trundling down this nice sunlit path, and suddenly you're lost. Suddenly you're wandering around and you're thinking, where am I, right? And suddenly the wood gets darker, and you think, you know, you've got sort of Hansel and Gretel and all these kind of fairy tales going through in the back of your mind. And the thing is, the thing that normally happens, all of the good stories about walks in the woods, the problem is always that you get lost. Right? And the key thing is you get lost because you go for a walk in the woods without a map, basically, or without a cell phone with a GPS compass on it. And the point about this talk is to try and argue that, in a way, with the Internet of Things, we're doing a very similar type of activity. We're basically launching ourselves into this without any kind of map, any kind of sense about actually where we're going and where we're deploying devices. So this is a talk about mapping the IoT. So there's lots and lots of IoT devices. I don't think anyone's going to argue with that, especially not in this room. They're often designed specifically to fade into the background. And either that's because they're sort of being driven by a kind of consumer perspective. Wouldn't it be nice if we had smart light bulbs that kind of just sort of blended into your everyday furnishings? Or because you're deploying them in sort of the built infrastructure, so you've got them as part of your highways or part of your rail network. But they're not designed to actually kind of shout, hello, I'm an IoT device. You don't tend to paint them bright yellow as a sort of starting point. What that means is that people are increasingly unaware about the technology that's deployed in the environment. It probably wasn't obvious which of the devices were actually connected, for example, back into the hotel's infrastructure. Is the door lock self-contained, or is it connected? Is the air conditioning connected? Is the TV connected? Is the fridge connected? Which of these devices are actually smart IoT devices, capturing lots of data about you, supporting interaction, potentially posing a risk, and which of them are just dumb non-IoT devices that are kind of isolated? Now, if you don't record where your IoT devices are, and you don't record what they're doing, then this, I'm going to argue, gives you lots of problems. And as a sort of society, we have form on this front, right? So 25 years ago, I was in this room and I was talking about work with the electricity board. So these are the guys and girls who provide power to you. And one of the tasks we were looking at, excuse me, one of the projects we were looking at was about how to stop them inadvertently digging through the cables they'd buried in the roads a few years ago. Right? This problem has not gone away. I was at a meeting a few weeks ago with some UK government officials, and they were just about to pump £50 million into trying to stop people drilling through cables in the road. 25 years on, we've made absolutely no progress on that. Right? We had plans about how we might be able to record the positions of cables, how people could access that while they were on the move. But essentially, the problem is half of the infrastructure was built in Victorian times. We didn't bother to record where it is. And then the rest of it was laid by a random collection of contractors who we had no control over and who probably lost the maps of where they put the cables. So we're not very good at recording where we put infrastructure in our highways. There's a sort of old thing that, you know, all's fair in love and war, but there's no possible justification for deploying things like landmines and not recording where you put them. Right? That's just simply not okay. And yet somehow we knew with deploying infrastructure like cables into the highways, we now know we should have recorded where they were, and we're having problems. And we know with mines, of course, that we should have recorded where they are, and we're having problems. And we know that the legislation, for UK folks, I'll do a different picture next time I do the talk. But the point about it is that the legislation now, a lot of the emerging legislation, requires us to talk about what kinds of data we're capturing and where we're capturing it. But that's hard because half the time we don't actually know. So if we continue to just deploy IoT devices without actually having any clue where we're putting them and any clue what they do when we do deploy them, then I'm arguing this is going to have the same problems that we had when we were doing cable networks, same problems that you have when you have your house and you're trying to use one of those crazy little stud detector things to work out where the water pipes are before you drill a hole. I mean, really, what is that? Actually, why don't you just have a proper plan that tells you where all the cables are? And you don't need to do the detection part. And we should be doing the same thing with the IoT. We should be being very systematic and very rigorous about recording about where these devices are. And if we do that, then we're going to get at least 3 benefits. We're going to make it easier for us to manage and maintain these devices because we're going to know where to look for them. I thought it was great, the talk yesterday morning about the idea of having a sort of 13-year commitment to update the devices. And then I was sort of trying to reflect on whether I would know where the devices I brought 13 years ago were. I thought, I have no clue. I don't even remember where I put my phone 5 minutes ago. The prospect of knowing where all of those IoT devices 13 years ago are living in my house and in my office and my car, no clue. So if we know where they are, we can manage and maintain them. We can support a much better view of privacy awareness. We can start to give people ideas of giving consent to going into smart spaces, spaces where data will be captured. Because at the moment, when you go into a space, you have no clue. You genuinely have no clue. The best case scenario is there's a sign on the wall which says, you know, TV cameras in operation, CCTV in operation. But now, in a way, that's probably the least of your worries compared to all the other data they might be capturing. It's very hard to give consent or to be aware of what's going on in the space because, again, we don't really record that. And I'll give a couple of examples later on about sort of opportunities for new systems and applications if we actually know where the devices are. So the proposal is quite simple. This is not a paper, by the way, with a solution. This is more a paper with a sort of an idea and a bit of a sort of call for arms. The idea is, wouldn't it be great if we systematically recorded where we were putting IoT devices and what they did? Because we don't. At the moment, we just don't have that record, and that seems like that would be a really, really good thing to do. So it's not just the location of the devices, it's actually the capabilities as well. And this is sort of distinct from the kind of platforms for IoT device management, of which there are many and lots of good ones, and sort of distinct from the public repositories of the IoT devices. So people have tried things like kind of wiki beacons. I don't know if anyone used this. This was a place where you could go and you could try and find out where BLE beacons were. And I think we went and there was something like 2 BLE beacons deployed in the UK. And I think this is not an accurate number. This is my sense, is that this is not an accurate record of how many BLE beacons are actually deployed in the UK. So these kind of repositories don't tend to work. And it's interesting to reflect on why they don't tend to work. So you've got some obvious challenges, right? If you want to map out the IoT, how are you going to populate that thing? Are you going to require people who are doing the deployments to actually then somehow record things? In the same way that, for example, now you require architects to actually submit digital plans for buildings. Is that one strategy? Are you going to crowdsource them? Are you going to crowd sense them? Are you going to have the devices themselves reporting where they are? How are you going to maintain it, particularly given that your IoT devices are moving, potentially, particularly that your IoT devices are power constrained, so there's sort of limitations on the amount that you actually want them to be reporting updates to the location. What are you going to use as your standard? And who's going to own these maps? You know, much as we all love our cloud providers, you don't necessarily want to share the location of all of your devices with them. What do you do about access control and security? And we've just got a paper coming out that looks at the security threats of if you really produce a map of the IoT, then what can you do with that? And we've been sort of focusing on the use of BLE beacons and IoT devices in a sort of smart campus environment where we use it for things like sort of student registration. It's kind of a bit unhandy if they know where the beacons are, because then they can take the beacons away and register themselves for classes in the pub. Right, they actually go to class, so it's not you know, there's implications if you actually don't control the access to those maps. There's a sort of notion about the challenge between proximity and location, because a lot of the IoT applications we build rely on a notion of proximity rather than the actual kind of geographic coordinates. And then there's obviously sort of challenges about how you make this thing scale, you know, because you're not just trying to do a sort of local scale. So a sort of example of what we have done, this is a system called Tacita. We've demoed it here a couple of times, so people may know it already. It's a display personalization system. So as I walk around campus, my phone basically downloads a map of where all of the displays are on campus. As I walk around, the phone can actually detect I'm about to go near a display, send off a request to get some personalized content on the screens. And that's now rolled out. There's 12,000 students who can use it. Basically, it's part of the standard software download at Lancaster now. And it's deliberately done using a map where the map comes down to the mobile device rather than proximity, because we think that gives us a bunch of advantages. In particular, users can adjust their behavior. So if you're a user and you want to have personalized content, you have a map that knows where to go. And if you're not, if you don't want personalized content, that's fine. You can either turn the application off or you can avoid where the screens are. It helps content creators because they know where the screens are and they know where the sensors are, so they can actually start to deploy out appropriate information. The system can kind of preempt user activity, so rather than having to wait until it detects that you're close by, your phone can know the direction of travel and it's got the map, and then it can inform the system ahead of time, hey, get some content ready for me on the screen. And of course, it's independent of the particular location technology, so it doesn't tie you into using proximities, something like beacons. So, if we were going to do a map of the IoT, what actually would we need to do? Well, I think there's sort of three key questions, really. So one is, do we actually need to legislate this? Do we think that having a map of where all these devices are is important enough that we should actually just simply make it a requirement? You know, we're not going to let you arbitrarily deploy devices. You must record where they are. You must have a way of updating that. If for no other reason than if something goes wrong, we know where to go and get them. Do we need new applications and services? I mean, the legislation is really more like the stick strategy, but is there a sort of carrot that makes people think producing that map is going to give me so much added value? In the same way that the display application was better built using maps than proximity, maybe we can find some other applications and services and make it really compelling for people to produce those maps. And then as a sort of community, we would need to develop some technology or leverage technology, of course, from the mapping folks, so agreeing on the schema, agreeing where the repositories are going to be, how we're going to open them up, how we're going to protect them, how we're going to ensure that we keep them up to date. And with that, I think I'll stop. There's other examples in a paper of applications and of challenges, but I think at this point it's basically, wouldn't it be cool if we could actually have a global open map of devices of the IoT? Thank you.